So I was in my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, a few weeks ago at my alma mater, Morehouse College. Yeah, right. Moderating a panel on men's health with former NFL players from HBCUs during the Super Bowl weekend. And our discussion about brain health and depression with these players, took several directions that were based in, kind of the era or the time period that these players played in. Some of the more veteran players discussed the challenges of being the only African American on the team, right? Others at a different time period spoke of being a player on the team that supported the civil rights movement and balancing that stance with others that were on the team that maybe did not support the movement, right? And then the youngest players, that were serving on this panel talked about being a part of a league, an NFL, where over 80% of the players are black, but most of the coaches and almost all of the team owners are white. And it made me think about the struggle for equality, right? Human dignity and human regard, how that struggle changes over time. How our work sees progress and breakthrough, but there's always more to do, right? This is true in the context, I think, of Dr. Carter Fuller and Alzheimer's research. He was the first African-American psychiatrist, which was a major breakthrough at the time. This came along to break this color line, and medical schools were mandated to prioritize diversity for their classes. But now we're faced with another challenge, right? And that challenge is, how do we ensure diversity in perspective and participation for priorities in Alzheimer's research? Participation and perspective. So when we omit one, we many times ignore the other. This is particularly important when we know that Black Americans are most likely to develop Alzheimer's than other groups. So perspective is important. When our research excludes diversity and participation, it also ignores multiple perspectives in how Alzheimer's might develop. A double jeopardy, if you will, that limits the ability to conduct what I think is really important, I spoke about yesterday, health disparities research. But most importantly, it threatens equity in this country. So I'll start quickly with some main points to guide my time today. Stick with me as much as you can. The fight for equality in this country began long ago. Race men like Frederick Douglass, we know him, Paul Cuffey, arguing for basic human dignity and human regard for Black Americans. That struggle led to a debate among the next generation's leaders in how Black Americans would engage American society at all as free people. Integration for Du Bois and his talented 10th. Segregation for Booker T. Washington and his Tuskegee experiment. And this engagement was met with, as we know, Jim Crow laws that forced differences in how people were able to live their lives, differences in life and liberty, which, as we know, led to the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, Shirley Chisholm, Malcolm X, to name a few, demonstrations for U.S. civility, fairness, justice, and regard. And since the civil rights movement, I think that we continue our struggle to be regarded. But much like the NFL player that noticed that the majority of the players are Black in the NFL, and that there's not one Black team owner in the NFL, our lens has evolved to one of equity in the pursuit of happiness. Equity that acknowledges history, privilege, and power differentials. Equity that accounts for all the time people of color have been excluded from American enterprises, excluded from wealth-generating corporations and important research that increases quality of life and extends healthy living. So let me just say it outright. Diversity in Alzheimer's research is fundamental to protecting the public health of a nation when all people are living longer. And is a next step of Dr. Carter Fuller's legacy a next step in Frederick Douglass's work, a next step in the promise of civil rights. In this race for a cure for Alzheimer's, this field deserves broad input from diverse groups, including Black Americans right here in Wisconsin. Important frameworks are in place to guide this inclusion. They come from Dr. Peggy Dilworth Anderson, who's in North Carolina. I think she's been a speaker here before. Dr. Carrie Gleason, who's here in the room, one of our NIA grantees. These frameworks value collective histories and diversity among groups. They build trust with communities and families and seek scientific rigor to engage communities and do the work. Researchers should be intent on setting up goals for diverse perspectives and populations. It's goals for this. Benchmarks from the very beginning of the process. Exclusion criteria, I'm speaking to researchers in the room and that are watching, should reflect this commitment, meaning that leaving people and their perspectives out of the research design should be linked to some defendable scientific strategy, not merely because of challenges that threaten and demand cultural awareness, commitment, and creativity. But we know these goals for Alzheimer's research can be developed and ultimately ignored, leaving plans incomplete and agreements unkept. I want to spend my time here today not discussing the science of how Alzheimer's disease might develop in the brain per se, but focusing on first the context in which our study of brains and the life perspectives that affect those brains must be diverse. And in honor of leaders like Dr. Carter Fuller and my mentor, who I'll talk a little bit more later, Dr. Bill Jenkins, speak a bit about the voices of reason, courage, and justice. Folks who speak truth to power and challenge this double jeopardy of exclusion. Can you stay with me on that? Yeah. Okay. So a couple weeks ago, I was watching a very good documentary on Jane Fonda on HBO. Did anyone see that one? I thought it was, I thought it was well done. Jane Fonda grappling with identities of status and wealth and fame and entitlement, and how this conflict led to her being a very engaged activist, really, for inclusion and equality. In the 70s, I did not know this information about Jane Fonda, committing many parts of her life to being a voice around these issues. Well, anyway, during the course of the show, there's a mention of her ex-husband, billionaire, business mogul, Ted Turner. We remember Ted. Ted has recently himself been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, so our thoughts and prayers are with Ted and his family. But at some point during the documentary, there's an older clip of Ted Turner discussing how to deal with challenge to plans in business, which he said, if you do nothing, you don't risk anything. But not doing anything gets you nowhere. If you do nothing, you don't risk anything. But not doing anything gets you nowhere. It made me think about what we would say. It's an interesting play on words, and it, Ted was essentially saying no risk, no reward. And, no risk, no progress. And as a former athlete, it made me think about, what we would say. You got to have some skin in the game if you want to win, right? So given Ted's stature as a powerful, successful leader of business operations, it made me ponder the effects of inaction or silence in the face of challenge to plans or business operations. So put another way, when those that are accountable or who are accountable to the implementation of an activity make a decision to do nothing when plans are unmet, can the initiative ever be successful? Can the initiative ever be complete? My own Office of Special Populations, Judge Mitchell mentioned that I direct the Office of Special Populations at the National Institute on Aging. We collaborated with another division there at NIA to make some pilot project awards on health disparities. And our original plan was to have a meeting with the awardees. And we simply ran out of time. We were not able to have that meeting in the last fiscal year. And if many of you I've talked to yesterday and today have worked in government before. If you know how a bureaucracy runs, you would understand how we missed that deadline. And while one approach is to acknowledge this and commit to being better next time, another is to merely celebrate what we were able to accomplish. Just pat ourselves on the back on what we were able to do. It's always a good time to support health disparities research, but to remain silent on the parts of the plan that we missed masks the fact that our ultimate success was not obtained. It means that we should evaluate what went wrong and rectify it the next time. Hold ourselves accountable and take the risk to be better next time. So I mentioned earlier Dr. Gleason and Dr. Peggy Dilworth Anderson and their frameworks for the science of recruitment and retention in Alzheimer's research. And that framework acknowledges how important it is to respect the collective histories of populations and communities, the people that are here in the room. I would also argue that there's a national history. I work for the federal government, a national organization, that is relevant for today's discussion on inclusion, diversity, in Alzheimer's research. So I've been keenly interested in the success and function of our United States government and the intention of a United States of America that values equality and rights for all. Now, I won't go too deep here into American history, but can you indulge me just a few minutes to talk a bit about American history? I promise I'll tie it back. Can you indulge me for a minute? Can you stay with me? Okay, all right, come on now. Well, the leaders of the revolutionary cohort, and I'm talking about Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, many others, they held lofty intentions for the United States that included diverse participation in a democracy that prioritized equality. The revolutionary generation, as they're called, visualized a country free of colonial rule, where all men were created equal and free to pursue happiness. Has there ever been a United States as originally planned and intended? The answer to that question led me to Mr. Joseph Ellis in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Founding Brothers. Great read. And in it, there's a chapter titled The Silence, where Ellis describes this original American spirit and how the spirit of 1776 has come to serve as a reminder and to hold us all accountable to equality and the respect for diversity. But we know American history, and we know that there were a few obstacles to those intentions. First was an issue of operations and the need for a class of people to labor and work the many natural resources this land had to offer. King cotton, tobacco. Someone had to do the hard work, the manual labor, and produce resources fast for this new country to compete on the world market. A second reason I think these original plans of the United States were not realized, linked to what I believe is steeped in human regard and human dignity. In the free enterprise environment of this new country, during the Revolutionary era, in theory, any person, regardless of status, was able to take a plot of land, develop a product like cotton or tobacco, and engage in national and international trade. While the spirit of 1776 called for equality and fairness, this free enterprise bonanza demanded that a hierarchy be established with specific exclusion criteria on who was deserving, who would be regarded as human. So, again, thanks for bearing with me on this that's a little context on this long ago American history, but I do think it could be relevant to our discussion on inclusion and diversity in Alzheimer's research. The point is that something happened in between what was originally planned and what was actually accomplished. And in his book, Joseph Ellis says that a large part of what happened is that well-intended, moral people with revolutionary power chose to do nothing and stay silent about America's most important ideal, avoiding the risk to put some skin in the game. You know, there's a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that really hits home, and it keeps me when I'm beset by, the heartbreaks of life. And it's when he says that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So even as we talk a little bit about American history and the period of Reconstruction proved to be outright dangerous for Black Americans in this country, physically harmful, that arc, and the courageous voices of people like Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Dr. Solomon Carter Fuller, led to a somewhat acceptance that Black Americans would be included in America's society. But as the lynchings and brutality slowed, some of these United States developed policies and laws that separated and excluded Blacks from full participation in society. If the federal government, where I work, mandated full access to important institutions, some of these United States would create circumstances where entrance came at a cost to civility and social justice. So as we grapple with diversity and inclusion for Alzheimer's research and question why there's little diversity in these studies, we must acknowledge the point that the nature of injustice changes as it is forced to change. As the federal government cracked down on lynchings and brutality, some states developed laws to exclude Blacks from aspects of American life that were important for full participation. And leaders like Dr. Benjamin E. Mays and my own mentor, Dr. Bill Jenkins, organized to pursue social justice. The structure still allowed some to create new and creative ways to threaten civil rights. And I mentioned my mentor, Dr. Bill Jenkins, who was a professor at Morehouse College, Judge Mitchell, who unfortunately, and I'm very saddened to know that Dr. Jenkins died 2 weeks ago. Now, I mentioned him intentionally because he leaves a legacy of research and activism and mentoring for social justice. Bill was a foot soldier. Dr. Bill Jenkins was a foot soldier in Martin Luther King Jr.'s Army for young students during the Civil Rights Movement. He went on to start the first graduate program in public health at Morehouse School of Medicine and exposed many Morehouse men, like Judge Mitchell and I, and Spelman women to career options in public health. He was a real bridge builder. And related to today's discussion, he was the first whistleblower on the Tuskegee syphilis study when he worked with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And he was one of those mentors, and I've met some friends here in the room who I get the same vibe where everyone had their own story about how he helped you along the way. He made you feel like he was yours and yours alone. But Dr. Jenkins mentored over 600 students to careers in public health. And one of his prevailing messages was, I will always remember this, at some point, you've got to do the work. He said, Carl, at some point, you got to do the work. You have your suit on, you're on time, we talked about it, now you got to do the work. For today's discussion, I think, after including diverse enrollment plans that sound good for the research proposal, after having lunch to talk about who on the team would be responsible for recruiting the Black Americans in Madison, sending the proposal off to the funding agency, and after a long wait celebrating the notice of grant award, you got the money. We've got to roll up our sleeves and get to work. Do what we said we would do by doing the work. And for my Dr. Jenkins, you know, and he is mine, this work was around dignity, regard, fairness, and humanity in biomedical research. You see, during Bill's time of protecting civil rights, an issue in research was using Black Americans for horrible examinations and tests to learn about the human body. Interestingly enough, this earlier history that I spoke of, Black men were not considered to be human at all. But as scientific demands developed, these men were all of a sudden human enough to be the focus of how science would understand syphilis for protecting public health in the United States. You see how that changes over time? Yes. Withholding treatment to these Black men to understand the course of disease in the human body, an unethical commitment to recruitment and retention. At that time, researchers had no problems finding Black men for research, going into the community in Macon County, Alabama, using creative ways to withhold treatment to these men in this study. Some for over 20 years. No problems at all. Creativity, all types of ways to keep people in studies. Well, I mentioned earlier, the nature of injustice changes as it is forced to change. And I argue that after people like Dr. Jenkins blew the whistle on Tuskegee, injustice changed to a period of severe exclusion. In a macro sense, one might think of Michelle Alexander's work on mass incarceration as a means from removing Black Americans from society altogether. The companies that profit from this exclusion, the institutions that support this, that make money off of this. This exclusion might extend to biomedical science and research focused on diabetes, asthma, and Alzheimer's. And similar to the ways that we debate whether people's behaviors or social factors are more important for their life circumstances, the lens for this exclusion of Black Americans in research seems to focus on whether these populations are hard to reach or if we are simply not trying hard enough. Sadly, the Tuskegee example provides, the Tuskegee syphilis study provides an example of when researchers were trying hard enough. It can be done. So in bringing all of this back to Alzheimer's disease, similar to a time when resources were plentiful at the beginnings of the United States, we're in a revolutionary era, I think, of Alzheimer's research support. This is important, and again, I bring this back to Judge Mitchell's testimony because our loved ones, grandparents, parents, uncles and aunts are developing this devastating disease that affects our families and communities. This is real life for people. With the help from the Alzheimer's Association and other reliable partners, the National Institute on Aging, where I work, has received millions of additional dollars from Congress to support research in this area. Researchers have used these resources to focus on areas like the biology of cognitive decline, genetics, caregiving. We're funding researchers all over the country and world in a race for a cure. In receiving these research dollars from NIA, researchers agree to a standard for diversity and inclusion. So when we make an award, when we give money to an investigator for this research, there's a declaration of inclusion in the form of plans for enrolling women and racial and ethnic populations into the study. Peer review committees provide a rating for the entire research application that includes these plans for diversity. So you can't get the money from NIA without having a plan for recruiting women and minorities into the study. There's a shared responsibility for inclusion between the researcher and the staff at NIA where I work. One of implementation for the researcher, and the other of holding to accountabilities by the federal staff person. So to tell you that the inclusion of Black Americans in NIA-funded Alzheimer's research has been challenging probably comes as no surprise. You all are working hard here in Madison. We've got other places where we fund, where there is a lack of diversity. But what might be shocking to you is that there is the intent among us stakeholders. Just like the American Revolution and the original intent of equality, the original spirit of any NIA-funded Alzheimer's research includes a plan for diverse enrollment. But just like the American Revolution, it does not always work out this way. Just like the rush to move to natural resources, to move the natural resources like cotton to the world market forced early Americans to make some rash decisions about human dignity and human regard and equality, the pressure of generating and publishing research results in high-impact journals may force researchers to ignore the original spirit of their research application and ignore diversity and inclusion altogether. But just like a United States without a respect for equality, given its original intent, can NIA-funded Alzheimer's research without diversity and inclusion ever be successful? And maybe more important, given that Black Americans, again, are twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's, can research findings that omit this group ever truly be complete? How can you race for a cure when the people that are disproportionately affected aren't in the studies? And the silence among us, because we're all together in this, that are accountable, researcher and NIA, has up until recently been concerning. Much like Ted Turner's idea, many of us have chosen to do and say little. No skin in the game, in hopes that this will work itself out. Let other people deal with it and decide how to handle it. Avoid the risk altogether. As I begin to close, I believe that these agreements between researchers and funding agencies like NIA, where I work, are critical for upholding any standard of diversity for Alzheimer's research. However, I think we need to re-examine our commitment to the standard. Frameworks exist everywhere. There's a framework for diverse enrollment, framework for how to engage communities. There's a framework I spoke of yesterday on how to think about the different perspectives and how they relate to Alzheimer's research and Alzheimer's disease. But I'm at a point now where I think we have enough instruction on how and what to do. We must now encourage our enterprise to follow the legacy of Dr. Bill Jenkins and do the work. And this includes using new technologies to engage, tailored creativity to find ways to participate with communities. Going door to door works. There may be some other methods that work as well. We need to know those. Identifying and partnering with community-based organizations that may be led by African Americans who have been successful with recruitment. Our community-based organizations work. And just like Dr. Bill Jenkins, this work means speaking up, saying something when you see that a commitment to diversity is missing. On your research team, at your institute, back at NIH. Doing nothing gets us nowhere, just like Ted Turner said. So the moral arc bends towards justice, as Dr. King said. This arc will be extended by those who are in high school right now, college, finishing graduate programs. They're not here. What opportunities will we leave for them to contribute to this passion and creativity that we have for diverse recruitment and retention? I mentioned earlier that NIA and Dr. Cerise Elliott is leading a funding opportunity to provide resources for creativity in recruitment and retention. This should be a start, in my opinion, for creating a science for recruitment and retention in aging research. A science that evaluates these strategies. This is not a one-off satellite practice just to see if we can get diversity in these studies. Diversity is fundamental to Alzheimer's research. Our commitment to diversity should be matched with scientific rigor, with training and research resources to support the importance, if it truly is important, to this research. So in summary, as I end, diversity, I'll say it again, diversity is in Alzheimer's research is fundamental to public health in the United States. Excluding Black Americans and other racial ethnic groups at all levels in our research enterprise, including where I work back at NIA, connects to a long line that I've described here today of bias, injustice, and discrimination. When people aren't around, it connects to a long line of what has been going on before. That's my point. This is not new. A lack of diverse participation and perspective reduces our chances to understand how this devastating disease develops in all U.S. groups. A double jeopardy for health disparities research and equity in the United States. Thanks for having me here today for this wonderful event.